I'm going to start with a simple principle, a principle that I believe, a principle that I think is true in our lives, and that's this. People grow spiritually as they connect relationally. You know, sometimes what we tend to do is we tend to separate the idea of spiritual growth and maturing, you know, from the reality of normal life. But you know, something that I've found really interesting, in the Hebrew language, there's no word for spiritual because everything is spiritual, including our relationships. And that God allows us to grow spiritually as we grow in our relationships. That's one of the reasons why Jesus had disciples. He had a community. He had a group of people that he invested into, but they learned to be this community for one another as well. The greatest commandment and the greatest instruction that God has given us is this, that we would love God and that we would love one another. They're inseparable. You know, that to love God is to love one another. To love one another is also an expression of loving God. And as we recognize this, we recognize this truth. We really become like the people we hang out with, right? I remember when I was in the armed forces in NS many years ago, our instructors used to use the word turbine very often. So whenever there was an expression of exasperation, it was turbine. So you know, like if you did something silly, you were called a turbine, right? Like, walao, you turbine, right? And it so happened because all our instructors were using this word, and I'd never heard this phrase outside of this particular platoon and outside of, you know, NS in the rest of my life. But when we were there, all of us naturally ended up turbining one another as well. Why? Because we really become the people we hang out with. And therefore, this idea of a spiritual community is so central to God's plan for how we become fully devoted followers of Christ, how we become more Christ-like, as it were. And so that's why we have life groups. You know, there is a formal structure around it, there's a format to it, but at the heart of it is this, that we learn to be a spiritual community. One of the purposes of our life groups is so that we can be and become a spiritual community. But here's the thing, how do we grow to become more of a community? So it's not just a bunch of people who roughly know some things about each other coming to do a Bible study, but it's a community, a place where we are known and we know one another, a place where we are served and we serve one another, a place where we truly connect. There's a level of honesty, of transparency, of intimacy with one another. How do we become a spiritual community? Today I want to share with you one simple tool that can help us open up our conversations so that we can learn to connect with each other, as well as learning to grow with what God is doing in our community and in our midst. This is Discipleship Everywhere, a platform for discipleship vision, inspiration, and training wherever you are, whenever you need it. All have a story. Some of us think that our stories are exciting, but most of us think that someone else's story is more exciting than ours. Sometimes we think, my life is just ordinary, it's okay, I go to school, I go to army, I go and work, I have a family, and I'm trying to do the best with who I am and what I have. But our stories matter. The scriptures tell us that when you were, even before you were born, God formed and fashioned you, that He knitted you in your mother's womb. And then it goes on to say this, however, that there was a book written and all the days that you were to live were written in this book. See, God was concerned about the story of your life. God was concerned about the vision and the dream that He has for you as He released you into this world to exist and to be. All our stories matter. And I've discovered this, there isn't a single person whose story is not inspiring, whose story is not something that we can gain from and learn from, whose story doesn't open up our understanding of the other person. And that's what I want us to think about today. When we come together as a community in life group, sometimes we can come and the primary focus can be, let's do the Bible study. Now, the scripture is important because without the scripture and the presence of God in the midst of us, then we can just end up being a social community. However, the flip side of this is equally important, that we don't just end up becoming a Bible study and miss on the social value of being a spiritual community. And so I'm going to share with us a tool. It's called the story graph. And it's a really simple tool, but it's a tool you and I can use in our life groups and in our ministries to invite one another to share their story. Now, if we go to someone and say, hey, next week, can you share your story? Most people will freak out. What do I share? Like how long? And, there's so many things. And what do I say? Actually, my life, okay, nothing to say about. So this tool is actually really simple. It's like a graph. And you will just plot points on this graph of high moments, of low moments, and of significant moments. And this allows somebody to decide what and how much the person wants to share. And so what you would do is you'd give some instructions. It would be very simple. Get a piece of paper, draw two axes, an x-axis and a y-axis. Is this the right direction? Yeah, x and y-axis. And then you would decide the highs and the lows and the significant moments in your life. Think about the great moments you had, that to you this was a great thing. It could be a holiday, it could be when you had a present, that was really significant. It could be graduating, it could be a gift that you were given, it could be your wedding day, it could be the day he proposed to you. Think of the high moments, and then think of the low moments. It could be a death, it could be a loss, it could be a breaking up of a relationship. It could be things that may not seem significant to other people, but to you this was a low moment that happened. Maybe it was a friendship problem that just caused you to feel isolated, or a moment that happened that caused you to feel afraid. Highs and lows. And you just think about these moments. And then you think about significant moments. Maybe there were moments that were significant to you. It could be your baptism day. It could be graduation day. It could be when you got your first job. Or to you, it could be things like, when you got your first pay and you were able to take your family out for a meal. Significant moments. And then what you would do is you just plot them on a graph. How high were the highs compared to each other? How low were the lows compared to each other? And where were the turning points in that? And then you just draw a line graph and you connect the dots for the moments of your life, going chronologically from left to right. That's pretty much what a story graph looks like. But what do we do with the story graph? You would then invite someone to use their story graph as a means to share their story. Why this is helpful is because so often when we share our story, we can get lost. And we can forget the moments that really matter. But if you have people in your life who prepare this, then as they come, then they just have to talk through these moments. And this also then allows everybody else in the life group to, be curious about this person's moment. For instance, if somebody shares, actually our graduation was a really significant moment, or the opposite, my graduation wasn't a significant moment, it was actually a very low moment, then somebody could say, hey, would you be okay to share, how come it felt like such a low moment for you? That most of the time people would think it's a good moment. And maybe this person would share about a circumstance where, it was low because even though this was the day this person graduated, that there was nobody to celebrate that moment with this person. And then you start to get an insight into the reality of this person's soul and this person's heart. And so as we share with one another, invite the group to be curious about this person's story. What are the moments that happened that were good? What are the things that need clarification? And allow the person who's sharing the story to obviously take his or her time to decide how much he or she wants to share. And as all of this happens, what you do is you pray. Because God always shows up in moments like this. As you start to discern, where was God in the midst of this story? Where were the turning points? And what you do as a leader is you help this person who's sharing the story see the dots that God was putting in this person's life and how God was connecting these dots and how God was there. Yes, even in the low moments, how God was there. And it's because of those low moments how this person came to know Christ, perhaps. You use the story as a means of ministry as well. Because sometimes as a person shares a low moment, the pain may still be very real. Take time to stop and minister to one another and say, thank you for being vulnerable. Thank you for sharing about the pain. You know what? Is it okay if we just pray for you right now as we take a pause in your story? We want to listen to the rest of it as well. But we know that God has allowed you to be a part of our community so you can be healed, you can be restored. And we love you as you are. But we want to pray for you right now that you would be healed and restored from this pain. Allow these moments of ministry to happen as well. And then as the person finishes their story, affirm the person, share about the strengths that you see in this person's story, and then just have everybody pray for this person. Now this is something, a tool you can use particularly when a new person comes to your group. Because sometimes, when somebody comes to your group, it's just a friend of someone, but nobody else really knows this person or knows the details of this person's story. So if you would take a time in one life group meeting or ministry meeting and say, hey, so-and-so, Frank or John, would you come and share your story graph and help them understand how to make that story graph and let them share that story graph? Then what can happen as a result of that, you can invite other people to quickly share their stories as well. And we can have a great sense of knowing one another. Because as we really get to know each other's highs and lows, we get an insight into one another. And through that, God can knit our hearts to one another. And in these divine God moments, He does something special. He causes us to really understand what it means to be a spiritual community, to be His family. Perhaps you would consider doing this in your life group. But start as the leader, to be the one to show the example. Sit down, and it'll take you about 30 minutes or 45 minutes at the most. Get a piece of paper, draw that graph, put your highs, your lows, your significant moments, and join the dots. Create this graph of your life story. And then bring it to your group and say, I just want to share a little bit about my journey. And then you allow them to hear your story. And then you invite the next person in your group. Perhaps you can do this once a month so they can continue with the curriculum in learning together. But as you do this once a month, you spend some time really connecting with each other. If it allows for you to have a time where you come together and have a meal and just connect and fellowship with one another, use that time to connect and hear one another's story as well. May you be blessed to know that your story matters and that God works in and through the highs and lows of your life. And may we learn to listen in and understand one another because we hear and know their story as well. We hold their story with honor. We hold their story with grace. We hold their story with patience and with caution as well. And in doing that, perhaps we will become a spiritual community more and more.